Joining me now to talk more about the reaction in the United States and how this will affect the American election are Sarada Peri. She is a former speechwriter for President Barack Obama, and Richard Painter. He's a former chief White House ethics lawyer in the George W. Bush White House. Welcome to Power Play to you both. And Sarada, I'll start with you. How, if at all, does yesterday's verdict change how voters in the United States feel about their choices for president now?
Well, honestly, it's really hard to tell right now. So all we have so far is polling that's been done over the past few months to get a sense of what voters think. And up until now, all of that has been hypothetical. And it's really hard to poll people on hypotheticals because it's hard to imagine how you'll feel about something when it actually happens, right? So we know from previous polling that, there is a small 2-3% of folks who are, registered or likely voters who could potentially be swayed by this and who could potentially say, you know what, I'm not going to go with this convicted felon, former President Donald Trump. But honestly, it's really hard to tell. So what I'm going to be watching for over the next few weeks is the polls that are going to go out in the field now, seeing how folks are going to respond and specific subsets of populations. So we know from the previous polling that, people who are younger, voters of color, folks who were more likely to think that the 2020 election was in fact, held well and that it wasn't stolen for Donald Trump, against Donald Trump. Those are the folks who are more likely to potentially be swayed by this. So I'll be curious to see what the polling will show now that we actually have a verdict.
Richard, you posted on X yesterday that the GOP must find another nominee. Americans, quote from your X post, Americans will not elect a convicted felon to the White House. Why do you think that?
Well, it's quite clear that Donald Trump has serious legal difficulties, not only these 34 felony counts, but he has 3 other criminal indictments on a lot more serious charges. Not to mention his civil fraud judgment running to hundreds of millions of dollars in New York, and his sexual assault and defamation judgment against him. Donald Trump is not a credible candidate. And I think it's critically important that we have a real election in the fall where we have 2 alternatives representing the 2 major political parties. And that's not what we're going to get. We're going to have the incumbent president of the United States who has strong support from Democrats and some independents, but then a candidate on the GOP side who is simply not viable, and a lot of voters voting for Biden simply because the Republican Party has refused to recognize the reality that we're not going to elect a convicted felon. We've never had a president, former president, convicted of a felony or even indicted for felonies. And we have never had a candidate for president of the United States from a major political party who has been indicted for felonies or convicted. And I just don't think that's going to be acceptable to mainstream voters.
Richard, I take your point, but in the hours, just the last 24 hours, his campaign has raised $34.8 million in the form of small dollar donations. So how do you respond to that if you think that there should be somebody else, if it seems like even the money is behind him at this point?
Well, you're always going to have your core voters in both political parties who will say that their political party can do no wrong. You're going to have the far right that has a lot of influence, yes, in the Republican Party. You're also going to have the far left. I think the far left has less influence in the Democratic Party, or we wouldn't have Joe Biden in the White House, who's more of a moderate liberal. But the bottom line is that doesn't reflect the sentiment of the vast majority of the American people who are in the center politically. And that's where the election is going to gravitate in November. But this year, what is unique is not just that we have political extremism, extremist positions coming from Donald Trump, but he is a convicted felon. He has 3 other felony indictments with trials pending. He is arguing to the United States Supreme Court that the President of the United States is immune from criminal prosecution. I filed a brief on behalf of former admirals and generals with the U.S. Supreme Court, pointing out how this would wreak havoc for the chain of command in the United States military if the president cannot be prosecuted for crimes, but he could order the military to do whatever he wants, including launch attacks, kill political rivals. We can't live in a democracy that would function this way. It's simply not going to work. The American people are too smart to buy this. Whether they agree with President Biden on policy or not, that's not relevant. this November for a lot of swing voters.
Yeah, and in spite of that argument, a number of polls, and these were all done obviously before yesterday, suggested that Trump leads Biden in most of the 7 crucial swing states that will likely decide this election. So, Sarada, you have, despite that, said that there's no turning back from Biden and looking at another candidate. Do you still feel that after yesterday's verdict?
Yeah, I mean, of course, Richard is right that it's an abomination that we're even considering electing a convicted felon. And the truth is that, the country is so polarized that it is, of course, hard to tell whether or not people will ultimately, beyond his base, vote for Trump. And I think that what you're seeing up until now is, of course, Biden has been struggling in the polls. Frankly, so has Trump. And this is, again, this sort of the way that we are polarized, it's so tight that this election is going to come down to the margins. So now it's going to be incumbent upon the Biden campaign to make sure that people understand who Donald Trump is and what just happened and why, as Richard said so eloquently, this is unprecedented and completely unacceptable to have him as president. One of the reasons that Biden has struggled in the polls is that people's memory of the Trump presidency has kind of faded. And in a way, for a lot of people, it was such a traumatic experience between COVID and the economy and everything that and Trump's outrageous presidency. It's almost like people have just sort of washed that from their minds. So it's now going to be incumbent upon the Biden campaign to really tell this story, to elevate, first of all, what Trump has done, what the fact that he is a convicted felon, and the fact that, he's a convicted felon because he thought he was above the law. He thought that the law doesn't apply to rich people like him and powerful people like him. And that's something that the American people actually don't like, right? They don't like the fact that he, tying it all together, also just promotes tax cuts for the wealthy, that he wants to give favors to, his wealthy friends, and the fact that he has always been and will continue to be about himself. And so the Biden campaign needs to continue telling that story and making sure that people don't forget what happened in New York yesterday, and that they put it in the context of a bigger picture story of what a second Trump presidency would mean. We barely survived the first one, given January 6th, and we can't survive another one. And it's going to be up to the campaign to really tell that story very clearly, and then reach those few voters who still have not made up their minds, who are in fact persuadable, who could be persuaded by this. Because honestly, yes, the polls are really tight in those races, and Biden hasn't been doing well in those battleground polls. But the truth is, it is all going to happen on the margins, right? Whatever happens in November will happen on the margins. So it's going to come down to a few thousand votes in a handful of states, as it has the last election and previous elections too. So every single vote's going to matter, and I'm hoping that the campaign will tell that story.
I've got less than a minute left. I want to put this question to both of you. We'll start with you, Richard. What does political discourse look like in the United States in the months leading to the fall election?
Well, we have an asymmetry here with the two candidates. President Biden's problem is with the far left of the Democratic Party, the anti-Semitic protests on campus, the extreme left. And yes, it's the extreme left. Some of them didn't vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016 because they're upset that Bernie Sanders didn't win. But I think that people learned their lesson there. Those people will ultimately show up in the polls and vote for Biden. Trump, his support, though, is with the extreme right of the Republican Party. And that's the asymmetry, is Trump is running to the extremes. Biden is carefully avoiding the extreme left of the Democratic Party, and I think very, very intelligently so, because the middle is where these elections will be decided in the fall.
Sarada, last word to you on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's so distressing about what happened yesterday and the way that the GOP has just completely capitulated to Trump is you saw all these members of Congress immediately running to the microphones and defending Trump. And what they're doing is fostering increased distrust in our institutions, distrust in the Justice Department, and fueling the fire of Trump's rhetoric, which, by the way, also has led to threats against the judge and the jurors who were deciding the trial against him. And so the escalation of that rhetoric is, I think, frankly, terrifying. Even members of Congress have said, even Republicans have said that they've faced threats. So I think that this is going to be really sort of scary going forward, and you're not going to see the Republicans dial it down. To Richard's point, I think that while Biden has to show people that Trump presents this incredible threat, he also has to paint a picture of a different kind of America, the kind of America he's been trying to build, one that is, in fact, rooted in decency and the common values we share. And that's going to be, a huge challenge when you're also navigating an election against this person who was completely unhinged.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Sarada Peri and Richard Painter, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate this.